Hello, hello. We're gonna get started. Thank you very much for being here. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you all for this very important session on supporting common priorities for successful FfD4. My name is Samuel Plek. I'm an associate expert at the UNDESA, working for the Financing for Sustainable Development Office, and I'm very pleased to have a distinguished panel with us today. We have as a moderator Yann Olivier from ETTG, and then I'll let you introduce the rest of the panelists. But thank you very much, and looking forward for a successful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and yes, and thank you to the organizers for putting together this academic day. I'm sure this has not been an easy task. Since we don't have much time, just let me very quickly say a few words on the contents of this session and the approach and why we thought of putting this together also. And then I will very briefly introduce the panelists, both those that are in the room and the two panelists that are joining us online. So yeah, today I'm here, I think, with three of my different hats. So professor at university, but also the director of the European Think Tanks Group, which is working on a project precisely on how to work on common positions towards the conference in Seville. And also I'm a senior analyst at Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid, and the institute is working closely with the Spanish MFA, the Spanish administration, also on the different ideas and debates and challenges surrounding this conference. So we at ETTG, we tend to approach development issues from a political economy perspective. So maybe our starting point is that we are fully aware of the fact that we are in a very challenging context of geopolitical fragmentation. I would say that most of our reports start with that couple of sentences. Also, that the situation in this sense is much trickier, let's say, than regarding when compared to 2015, when the Addis Ababa conference was held, and our goal as a network of think tanks, but also regarding this project, but also regarding the rest of our activities, is both to put proposals on the table that are technically sound and politically feasible. So that would be, I would say, our general approach. So the idea is to build on the work that we have conducted, again, as a network and with the sum of the activities conducted by individual members, but I will let Karim explain a little bit more on that. Just let me very quickly introduce the panelists. So we will start with Karim Karaki, who is head of the Economic and Recovery Program at ECDPM, one of our members, and who is leading on this, I would say, work stream on the FfD4. Then we will pass the floor to Mónica Colomer, Ambassador at Large for Development Financing at the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation. Is that all? Yeah. And then to Rodolfo Reta Haddad, expert for macroeconomic, climate change and environmental affairs at the permanent mission of Mexico to the UN, to the United Nations. Also online, we have the pleasure to have Joseph Matola, Associate Economist from the South African Institute of International Affairs, better known as SAIA. Thank you, Joseph, for making the time to join us. And last but not least, here she is, Gabriela Keseberg-Dávalos, Independent Policy Advisor and a fellow of Southern Voice, another network of think tanks and academic institutions. So I think I will stop here, and I will give the floor to Karim, and I will kindly ask all speakers to try to limit their presentations to between 5 and 10 minutes so that we have time for the debate. And yes, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So Karim, the floor is yours.
It's working? Okay. Yes, can you go to the next slide? I'll dive right in the presentation so as not to lose time and maximize the time that we have for the discussion. Actually, Ileana already mentioned it, that the negotiations around the FfD4 will be probably more challenging than under FfD3, and that's given the geopolitical fragmentation that we have today, but also the growing SDG financing gaps and diverging recovery path that we observe as well. So that has an impact in terms of the kind of agreement that we will end up at the end of this process, but also the degree of ambitions that will be characterizing it. In terms of the objective of our work that's supported by the Agence Française de Développement, so we have 4 main objectives. I'll go quickly on them. The first one is about helping bridge positions between the Global South and Europe, because at the end, even if a policy process like the FfD4 is a technical process putting forward like practical options on how to be more impactful and how to leverage more investment for developments. At the end, it's also a means to strengthen relationships between regions, which, given the current geopolitical fragmentation, is something that's very important. The second objective is also to help shift the focus from only the technical discussion to the one on political attraction, what Ileana was introducing as the political economy in a way. So whether we talk about debt or tax reforms, we need to analyze also whether there is enough political buy-in to agree on some of those commitments. And why this is important is because we don't want to end up, to some extent, like we are today with FfD3, where what we see is also a limited progress in terms of the implementation. The third objective relates to fostering coordination. So as I mentioned, it's coordination between global actors, but it's also between and within countries, between ministries of foreign affairs, finance, and central banks, which for some of the topics and issues are actually have the mandate and the decision-making power that's necessary in order to make some of these reforms. And last but not least, it's also about trying to reconcile the development and climate agendas that are often seen as mutually exclusive, and where, depending on who you talk to, one focuses on the green and climate, and the other is talking more about development. And to address these objectives, what we've done is conduct formal and informal consultations with Global South think tanks, institutions and experts, as well as the EU and its member states. So the idea was to basically have a better understanding of what are some of the key priorities and interests of those regions in this FfD4 agenda. So next slide. And before delving into like the more detailed elements, let me brief you on some of the broader discussions and elements that I think also can help shape a bit the discussion that we're going to have today. So the first point is that you should not expect a revolution from FfD4, but rather a way to strengthen ongoing processes and reforms. And an additional element is that a lot of the elements that we see in the elements paper are not necessarily new. They were already discussed, sometimes mentioned in the FfD3. So I think that comes back to this issue of implementation that is quite key, and the limited progress that we've managed to achieve thus far. So what does that mean as well in terms of expectation for FfD4? I think FfD4 is going to be a great opportunity to bridge a lot of different policy processes, like the annuals of the World Bank, IMF, the G20, the COP, etc. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we have to better understand the added value of FfD4 in some of these agendas. So what can we do to strengthen those agendas? And sometimes at G20 level, there may be some areas of reforms that are a bit blocked. And then the value of FfD4 could lie in try to unblocking some of these elements. But the point that I want to make here basically is that we do have to look at FfD4 in a more strategic way, because it's such a broad agenda that touches upon many elements that we have to be a bit more focused in our discussions. And during our discussions with organizations from the Global South, I think 3 key priority areas always came back in the discussion. The first one is on supporting domestic resource mobilization and sound public finance management in a way that improves the business environment and help attract private investment. The second one, of course, is on optimizing international financial flows to complement national efforts. I think here the point is really also to have external financial flows that are better at taking into account and addressing the local priorities and that are driven at the national level. And last but not least, better accounting for differences between countries to enable targeted interventions. I think there's been a lot of discussions, including most recently at the COP, where, for example, the needs of the SEEDS states were, require a different type of approach than what we've seen in other countries. So something to be taken into account in the discussion. Next slide, please. So on the basis of the discussions, both with the Global South representatives, but also with Europeans, what we've tried to do here is not to be super comprehensive and address all the dimensions around FfD4, but rather give you a taste of where we see sometimes some convergence between the agenda, some divergence as well, and some point of reflection as well on the way forward. So on domestic resource mobilization, I mean, as we know, it's on mobilizing more revenues, but it's also about being better at spending them. And there, I mean, I will not go through all of these reforms, but maybe pick one or two. I think the first one on tax and tax on the wealthiest, that's a process initiated at the G20 level. We've seen quite some tractions, and that's also echoed in the Elements paper. And there we see that the FfD4 could be very useful in supporting this process by referring to it and underlining its importance, but also if we can be a bit more ambitious, it would be also to reflect a little bit more on the design and the actual implementation of such reform. I will just touch upon now maybe the tax governance issue, because it's been an issue that sometimes has had a bit of friction between Europe and the Global South. But I think that the discussions that we have with different stakeholders has shown that as long as, in terms of the UN process, that it builds on existing work done by the OECD and the G20 level, as long as that's done, then there's not a big blockage, let's say, on moving that conversation forward with several, actually, EU member states that also underline the value of the UN process. Maybe there, very importantly, I still want to mention the national development banks. I think that was a very interesting point that came back in the Elements paper, and that is also closely linked with other issues that have been tackled, such as having PDBs working better together, so not only the MDBs, but also the regional and local development banks, and the role of country platforms as well in this context. So there's many other elements about digitalization of systems and PFM, but I won't go into depth on these issues and move towards the second part of the agenda on domestic and international private finance, which has quite some traction and some alignments, I would say, on the specific elements. What we see in Europe is less ODA. I mean, we have to be quite honest on that, and that also explains partly why there is a greater focus as well on blended finance instruments as a means to address the SDG financing gap. I think that there, what's very important when you talk about blended finance is, I think in the Elements paper, there's on the one hand, like the focus on scaling that up in terms of the mobilization of the private sector, and on the other hand as well, looking at additionality and having blended finance work as well in least developed countries and fragile contexts. So those two objectives are quite difficult to combine in a way. And so we have to be a bit more strategic, perhaps, in terms of what we want to do when it comes to mobilization at scale. For example, we want to tackle middle-income countries where the private sector is very developed, and say climate, because this is also in line with the Paris Agreement. And it's likewise on the additionality dimension. Do we want to target specific contexts, like fragile context, specific issues that are underfinanced, such as climate adaptation? So these are some of the more strategic questions that should be also part of the thinking around FfD4. On mobilization, we highlighted a couple of issues there that I also mentioned, the lack of data and the regulatory challenges actually on this, and the changes that are needed. I'm referring here to Basel III and prudential regulations, for instance, that are big impediments for institutional investors to actually come in and invest in emerging markets and developing economies. And likewise, on blended finance, lots of questions on standardizing processes, having also MDBs type of asset that would be standardized, and more consolidation. We see a lot of blended finance vehicle, but the rationale to try to consolidate these ones. And last but not least, on credit risk assessment, this is also an area where we see a lot of, some degree of convergence, at least when it comes to transparency and having credit risk being more objective. And we think that this is also an area where there is some degree of convergence. International development cooperation, as I said, ODA commitments, I think it's important to recall the 0.7%. Yet we know that the political context in Europe is such that it will be difficult to honor. So the real question as well there is not to only focus on the volume, but also on the quality of ODA, how strategic it is, and whether it's driven or not also by national, local priorities. And those kind of discussion more focused on quality should also be reflected in terms of improving TOSD. Climate finance, I think we've talked a lot about this in the COP. I think a lot of elements paper or inputs to the elements paper were referring to the 300 billion commitment and making sure that those are reflected in FfD4. There, I think a particular focus was on those vertical climate funds and the needs for them to be to consolidate them, to build synergies between this type of funds, and to improve their efficiency and the way they are implemented in practice. On loss and damage, I think this is an area that is where I don't see a lot of convergence, but more divergence, actually. I will not dive into SDRs and MDBs, but we can pick this up, and I also invite my fellow panelists to approach some of these topics. Reforming the international development cooperation architecture is key. A lot of discussion on country platforms, so that has a lot of traction, notably the INFF, but also other types of platforms. So there, I think, more than just the platform, it will be very important to understand how we can make them effective, because too often what we see is platforms at the national level that are more about coordination, but much less about action. And I will conclude with those two last dimensions. So as you saw, I didn't talk about trade. I didn't talk about like other issues on technologies and so on, because we have little time. And the point is not to be that comprehensive, but focus on a few elements. So on debt and debt sustainability, I think there's quite some convergence on the need to reform the G20 Common Framework. This is a call that we've seen from both sides and where there is quite some traction. On climate resilient debt clauses as well, I think there's quite some convergence. The only, or one of the point I think there is having a systemic type of approach in contrast to a more case-by-case approach. So I think this is maybe where there is a bit of divergence, but generally speaking, there is a value in having these kind of clauses included in MDB's loans and so on. Then I think maybe it's also important to evoke the governance around that with the proposal for a UN intergovernmental process in the United Nations. I think that there is also, like when we touch about governance, is usually a very sensitive issue where we see a lot of divergence and we see that it's going to be difficult. I think on that discussion often the question is why don't we deal on that through the current channels such as the IMF and others. And maybe to conclude on addressing systemic issues, there again, I already mentioned the regulation issue, so I will just focus perhaps on the last two, on strengthening geographical and diversity and gender representation on boards, and the rules-based SDR insurance. I mean, I think that there's a lot of work to be done as well in battery thinking. The SDR rechanneling through MDBs, we see a lot of difficulties due to the position of the European central banks on that from a European perspective. but still some willingness to go forward and improve also the current IMF rechanneling mechanisms. So on that note, I would like to conclude and leave the floor. I think the point of that presentation was, as I said, not to be comprehensive, but rather lay the ground for a discussion and provide also fellow panelists opportunities to pinpoint at some of the areas that may not be there or that may be there, but to bring a different perspective perhaps on some of those elements. Thank you.
Thank you, Karine. So over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, first of all, to you and Jessa for this academic space, so key, to influence and be influenced. And thank you to you to be with us today, and for sure to Iliana and the ETTG and Karim for very comprehensive presentation that made my life easier in the road to Sevilla. Let me share with you some ideas on this very appealing title on supporting common priorities for a successful FfD4. So for us, this is the key question, no? What are those landing areas that we can agree on? And most importantly, not because they are landing areas, but that they can be transformative enough to enable us towards an effective fulfillment of the 2030 agenda. Because that must be the measure of success for Spain, a transformative change that helps to alleviate the critical situation in which many developing countries find themselves today. Moreover, the cost of inaction will be very high in terms of global trust and credibility of the multilateral systems. Hence, the importance of mobilizing the political will of all countries. And to ensure the adoption of a strengthened financing framework reflecting in an ambitious but realistic outcome document, it will be necessary to build consensus over the coming months on the progress to be made in the different areas of the financing for development agenda. We will have to match ambition with action and focus on those issues that unite rather than divide us. We must identify impact proposals that can be transformed into concrete actions in Sevilla, without forgetting to reach consensus on medium and long-term reforms to transform the system, because for us, Sevilla does not end in Sevilla. We are convinced that together we can find consensus, and we think that the elements paper presented by the co-facilitator contains a set of solid and ambitious proposals, and I would like to extend our deep gratitude to Mexico, Rodolfo, and the other co-facilitators for the effort and the outcome, the very, for us, very balanced and positive outcome. And we have identified some priorities that resonates with the elements papers, and this is our decalogue for success. We will see. First, in terms of domestic resource mobilization, we support the UN Framework Convention on International Fiscal Cooperation, progressive national tax systems, taxation of high-income individuals, green taxes, and the fight against illicit financial flows. Second, we support also the use, to explore the use of innovative ways of special drawing rights and the commitment to rechannel 50% of the 2021 SDR allocation as Spain has committed. In debt, the systemic and harmonized inclusion of debt pause clauses in the cases identified in the elements paper, but for all creditors, public and private, and extendable also to middle-income countries. 4, we advocate a reform for a reform of the international financial institutions to make them inclusive and representatives, and a commitment to achieve gender parity in their decision-making bodies by 2030. 5, other important issues are measures to facilitate the effective and impactful full mobilization of private finance. And we think that the element paper has a very sound proposals as this regards. 6, we have to take into account TOSDI as a measure of transparency of all flows contributing to sustainable development without diluting our commitment to 0.7 of ANP for ODA, which is our top priority for development cooperation. 7, INFFs. We think this is a tool to ensure that development financing responds to national priorities based on the development and financing strategy defined by the recipient countries. But to guarantee the full potential of the INFFs, it would be necessary for the MDBs to make better use of these platforms. 8, localization. The territory is the ultimate instance where SDGs are translated into development with schools, health centers, water and sanitation systems, etc. Sub-state entities are key actors that must also be taken into account in the financing agenda. And 9, we strongly support in this regard a strengthened monetary mechanism to hold us accountable for our commitments and to ensure that the financing commitments that are agreed upon generate mandates that are effectively monitored and evaluated. This will entail, among other aspects, the need for greater space for coordination between ECOSOC and the international financial institutions. And 10, finally, all of these previous actions will not be transformative enough if it does not benefit half of the world's population equally. A financing agenda that does not incorporate gender equality will not be transformative enough. In short, we look forward to progress and agreement on these and other issues on the road to Sevilla. You can count on Spain, and we count on all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'd love to discuss for sure, but let me give the floor to follow.
Is it? Oh, it's not. No, there we go. Thank you. It's just delegate kind of habit to raise hand for the mic. But thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rodolfo Reta. I am the macroeconomic, climate and environmental expert at the Mission of Mexico, but I'm also the expert facilitator for Mexico. And jointly with Zambia, Norway, and Nepal, I had the opportunity and the very positive experience to produce the Elements paper that you all kindly contributed to, over 300 submissions that have really damaged my eyesight, and I lost my glasses today. So if I don't see you well, I apologize. It's been a long morning. But just to come in and appreciate the space. You know, Mexico is very lucky to still be involved in this process since Monterrey. We don't like to say that we feel ownership, but we do feel a sense of responsibility towards the process, because when Monterrey happened in 2002, according to Ambassador Escanero, who you probably heard this morning, who was the facilitator back then, it came about in a spirit of experts trying to go into a common ground consensus approach to say, okay, we're going to design these goals. What do we need? How are we going to finance this? And this question of how are we going to translate ideas into actions and how much is it going to cost us was essential to bring us together and say, this is what we can all agree on is needed, and this is how much we can carry forward. And 23 years after, because we were supposed to have FfD4 in Monterrey plus 20, but it's 23, we find ourselves in a very difficult and very different context than we did in 2002, and also very, very different from 2015. When I started working this file, FFD was not really as important in the UN as it was in the past. It's like a roller coaster. Once there's a conference, everybody wants to jump in, and then once everything is agreed, they want to go back to health or other more fun files. But we were kind of in the middle of a crisis, right? Because we were not there in the pandemic yet, but the UN was having a liquidity crisis in 2019. And when the pandemic came, we had just started discussions on the affront to multilateralism. And back then, we felt that there was a lot of different ideologies converging into that. Multilateralism wasn't really the ultimate way to solve issues at the global scale, that sometimes regional efforts or even bilateral efforts were needed to push things forward. And when the pandemic hit, well, the UN kind of got its jolt to multilateralism, because that's when we also decided to once again sit down and examine where we were. And 3 years after the pandemic, or the recovery of the pandemic, which is not really fully recovered, we come into terms with a world that is impacted by triple planetary crisis, climate change, geopolitical conflicts, the increase in poverty rates, the inequalities, right? And of course, this divergence in north-south dynamics. And so as facilitators, we're very honored and very happy to present to the world an elements paper that, if you see it on paper, we do have all the ideas that we felt had synergies, had coincidence reflected. But if you look closely and you look at the people presenting this, you will see that this is the first regionally endorsed document in financing for development history. We all come from different regions. We all know what our regions need. But us four presenting this from each of our corner of our world means that we all know that this is something that we can build on, that doesn't necessarily go through the north-south divide and unites us from region to region, because the financing for development agenda belongs to everyone. And what we feel is that the elements paper, as well as the outcome document that we're going to translate all your comments this week into, has to be for everyone. So our main effort and our main focus was to try to find areas in which everyone's submissions kind of guided us into what are the key elements that we need that are both ambitious, can be concrete, and some of them can be implemented short-term, but have long-term mission. And what we're trying to get into the outcome document, and hopefully a very successful, approved by consensus document in Sevilla, is not only the blueprint for here to 2030, but beyond, right? We are not aiming to solve the world's problems in 5 years. I think most of us understand the reality of the situation. We need to prepare for when the 2030 agenda ends, but we also need to think ahead. And what comes after, when we either achieve it or we progress enough that we can actually sit down and think about what that world could look like. And I think that the elements paper hopefully reflects that. We've been getting a lot of positive comments, so thank you very much also to Ambassador Colmer for Spain's comments and positive feedback. You're not been the first, but we certainly appreciate that from the host country. We're trying to create the synergy and continue collaborating. And as far as the reason why I'm here to speak today is on the perspectives from the Global South. I will say this. Mexico is not necessarily the voice of the Global South, specifically if you ask the G77, because we're not in the G77. But we do have a good understanding, because Mexico considers itself to be a bridge country. We're not really a country that decides to go one way or the other. We're a country that tries to build bridges, and I think that as facilitators alongside Norway, Zambia, and Nepal, we found a good group of countries that do that often. But just to give you some insights on how the process went on the Global South perspectives, we are in a context in which most of the issues that have been already reflected, the crisis, the debt crisis, liquidity crisis, the need for urgent reform on governance of the IFIs, even a restructure of the financial architecture, not to mention the tax architecture. We've come into this point in which, be it the pandemic, be it the geopolitical shifts, be it the situation that we're in, the Global South really needs an answer. And they're really pushing for developed countries to come to the table and to have a discussion on what is really needed in terms of priorities and the resources that they require to fulfill their development. We are meeting now in the midst of 2 COPs that were not necessarily very successful, but that very clearly and evidently reflect the state of discussions, right? One side is demanding so much from the other, and one of those sides is saying that this is either historical or that this is something that hasn't been actually fulfilled. We can look back to 2015 in Paris. And the other side will tell you that they are working on trying to increase this, to try to fulfill this, but they need more accountability, more trust, more transparency from the other side. And the conversation that we're having with the Global South is, there's a lot of needs, there's a lot of priorities. The Addis agenda has not been fulfilled. The 2030 agenda has a 17% implementation rate. It is true that developed countries have done their part to fulfill some part of their bargain, but it's not enough. And there is also some truth in that the Global South does not have the resources or the, let's say, ability in place to honor some of those agreements, right? In the sense of there's no capacity building, there's no skills, there's no technical capacity in some cases. We talk about resource absorption, but there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of flows of capital, right? This has been called or referred to as a systemic issue in which, you know, for proliferation of many reasons, this has not been tended to. But when we go and look into FfD4, what we need to ask ourselves is, okay, if one side is asking for more, but doesn't really necessarily know how to fix this or have the skills to fix it, how do we get the other table to support that end so that while we're working together, the Global South can also do something for themselves? And this is the key aspect that, as facilitators and as Mexico, we've been trying to push as well. This is an agenda for everyone. This is not something that we're going to ask way more of one side or the other. This is a group effort, let's say it, complementary football, I like to call it for those who like sports. But the truth is, we are not really in a position or in a context in which this dialogue has been clear or has been done in a manner in which both sides really trust that the outcome is going to benefit everyone. And there's a lot of uncertainty. We look at the tax process. It's been mentioned multiple times. It is a good process, but it hasn't started in the right way. It hasn't started in the right way because it also stems from a failed promise from many years ago and then another fulfillment of a promise in Addis, right? But the way that it has come together, it's one side versus the other. And we reiterate this dynamic time and time again in the financing for development space that it's now translated into failed commitments in COP, because the COP was focused on climate finance as well. And those challenges kind of, as facilitators, put us in a position of what can we present where we know we can make middle ground, right? The conversation between, for example, climate finance and development finance, if it's development finance takes away from climate finance or vice versa, if it's double counting, right? The discussion that we need to do is how those two can complement each other, not necessarily fight each other for resources for developing countries, and how do we improve access to those, right? The narrative can be one is against the other. There is, okay, those things exist. Innovative financing mechanisms exist. How do we manage access for developing countries? How to make it easier for them? Do we need to restructure the way that those organizations who deal with this type of instruments present them to countries? Is there a fault of communicating that they exist? Do we need more, as Ambassador Colomer said, more localization? Do we need to get more people, not only the federal government involved, we need to get those in the local sectors, private sector engaged that also can contribute to unlocking these resources in the domestic side to come to the table and tell us how it would be easier for them. You know, we mentioned SDRs as facilitators. We looked at the SDR question. What is really needed? Do we really need another allocation right now, or do we need to find a more efficient way to make sure that the SDR allocation or the redistribution is made easier, right? So you will see that one of the elements in the element paper was this kind of playbook. If there's another pandemic, there's another emergency, how do we make this easier? Not going through all these loopholes to get everybody on the same page of how to access and how to distribute them. How do MDBs come into play, right? The synergies between metrics to evaluate progress and how do MDBs and IFIs integrate them? Do we need them to be just for specifics? Do we need them to be inclusive for everyone? The question is, are developing countries who are asking for resources really not in a position to share some of that access to others? That's a question that has to be asked within the negotiations. None of these initiatives that were, hopefully, that are in the outcome document will be discriminatory to the others. It has to be open. It has to be able to be implemented by everyone. And that is the message that, as facilitators, we kind of want to put forward from here to the zero draft. This is not, let's say, this is not necessarily the full Bible of what we're going to do for FfD4, but we need to sit down and discuss, out of these things that we've presented to you, what are the things that you can work with? What are the things that you already have some work that you can complement? And if not, how could you, as member states, civil society, private sector, academia, or IFIs, how can you take that back and constantly update us on how you can enhance them, how much progress you've made? You know, we talked about FfD3 not being a little bit more ambitious. I say that it has a lot of fluff. Maybe back in 2015, we were living in a very different world, but we were like fighting for ideals and we were fighting for progress in a different camp. But now we're fighting, in some cases, for the survival of some countries, right? And we're fighting in a country, in a world that has a lot of inequalities and high levels of poverty. So how can we take the commitments that we have in the outcome document and make them implementable, but also make them accountable and reportable, and that they have the proper follow-up? And we kept saying in the room as facilitators that the outcome document is nothing without the follow-up, and that's where the teeth of this document lies. And every time you see the document and every time you interact, you have to ask yourselves, is something that we're going to commit to ourselves to in Sevilla and that we're going to agree? It has to have a very, very precise follow-up, and everyone has to put their part, right? We talk about how are we going to incorporate some of the measures or some of the metrics on progress, right? We have Beyond GDP or MBI. They already have indicators, but those indicators need to be measured. They need to be constantly fed. We need more data, more statistics. We need all actors to be involved. And in this sense, the Global South has to step up also and say, these are my needs to fulfill this. If I need more capacity to give you data and information, we also need them to be more transparent. We also need them to have more updated systems so that they can constantly be feeding this to IFIs or to the international community or whatever body you decide we need to implement that hopefully doesn't cost too much BBI. But this is the way that we want to present the outcome in a sense, the elements paper. This is not genuinely only ideas that we thought could work. This is our ideas that you told us could work, because most of your inputs were identical in the sense of that you all know what needs to be solved. You differ on the method, you differ on the initiatives, but you all know what needs to get done. And I think that a lot of us in the membership and the facilitators, we understand the importance of Addis. And while some say that there's not been much tangible progress on Addis, there are really good things that have come from Addis, and there's really good progress that we've made in things that are not necessarily in Addis. So those issues of new and emerging issues, climate change, how do we incorporate the climate angle? You know, how do we strengthen gender equality? How do we retake the idea of INFFs and place it throughout the chapters, or not, maybe not in the outcome document, but how do INFFs support not only development cooperation, but how do INFFs can maybe support the DRM, right? So it's this kind of things of, we see it as a big puzzle, but we think that there's a lot of pieces that can be interchangeable in the initiatives that we're facing. And from what we gather, everybody already knows what they want. In the sense of you want something actionable, concrete, and something that we can carry over for 2030 and beyond. We have to have a lot of political will to make that happen. We have 6 short months to get the negotiation done, and sadly, because of time constraints, next year in February, the consultative part will be over because we will have to focus on what's on the outcome document. But we encourage everyone to keep looking at the evolution of the zero draft and keep feeding us and telling us how you feel it's going. If you need to consult or get member states or other actors involved outside of the facilitation, outside of the negotiation, please feel free to do so. Our job is to guide the negotiations, and our role will be to focus on the text. But once that happens, you have all the ability, all the freedom to congregate with other stakeholders, other member states. Do it cross-regionally is the only plea I get, so that you get different perspectives. We talk about siloed approaches here, and sadly, the FFD landscape is not different, right? You mentioned this, and even in the presentation, we see the European perspective versus the Global South. The Global North is bigger than Europe, right? So you have other actors, very important actors, right? So the conversation has to expand. And of course, take into consideration those who need it most, LDCs, SIDS. For them, some of these issues are life or death, sometimes survival, right? We see it specifically with SIDS and climate change, right? And so far, their needs have not tended to. So let's try to think of this elements paper and the outcome document that we will hopefully produce maybe January 15th. I'm not really sure when because of times. But let's make sure that this is something that we can all actually push forward. And as the success of the Agenda 2030 has been that every single individual has been able to find themselves in the agenda, what we want is that the Sevilla outcome, whatever the name of the outcome, that everyone can see themselves reflected as well, because we see this as a universal document, and that will tend to leaving no one behind, of course, but to make sure that everyone, even someone who's not really familiar with what we do at the United Nations, can understand the context of if my neighbor is doing well, then I'm doing well, right? And this reciprocity and the solidarity approach that we're trying to put forward. And I think that, at least on our end as Mexico, and we're very lucky to be partnered with 3 countries that really have, in over the past few years, moved forward in that approach to bring people together and bring their respective groups and regions together. And we really look forward to all your comments, positive or negative. Please just don't throw tomatoes at us in the panel. But we look forward to the discussion, and we look forward to carrying that into an outcome document that hopefully everybody can engage and work towards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo, for this very comprehensive view of the process. And we also do like to include different regions and different stakeholders in our conversation. So, yeah, maybe Joseph, we can start with you. Joseph from SAIA. I don't know if you can hear us. If not, so, oh yeah, perfect. Joseph, the floor is yours. Can you hear us? Yes?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Joseph?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
But we cannot hear Joseph.
But can you hear me now?
Ah, not very well. Just, yeah. Try again, Joseph, please.
Okay. How about now? Can you hear me?
Ah, not great.
Okay, maybe we can start with Gabriela.
Can we just move to Gabriela while we solve this technical issue, and then we will leave you? Okay, thank you so much, Joseph. So, yeah, maybe Gabriela, if you don't mind going first.
No, no problem. But you can hear me, yes?
Yes, we do.
Okay. I do hear myself, though. It's a bit weird. Anyway, just give me a second, because I see myself twice. Okay, all right. Okay, I want to show you. Well, first of all, hello from La Paz, Bolivia. And can I see the room? It would be great if I could see the room.
Well, we
Yes.
try to show you the room. Joseph, could you please mute your mic while Gabriela is speaking? Thank you.
Wonderful. So I want to show you something. Can you see it from where you are? It's a mango. And the reason why I'm showing you the mango is because it reminds me of the person who sold me this fruit, who is a 12-year-old girl who is out of school. Child labor in Bolivia is still legal, as it is still seen as essential for the survival of the family. So the reason why I'm showing this is because this is a stark reminder that I have every day when I see children working on the streets of Bolivia of why development matters and why the financing of it matters, of course. And today what I want to share are 3 insights of strategic conversations that we had within the Southern Voice Network, which is a network of 70 think tanks from the Global South, and also from conversations with other Global South stakeholders that will hopefully help precisely for the solutions that we are seeking at the summit. So the 3 points are the main topics that we have seen arise in these conversations with the network. The second one is the alternative spaces that the network and also other civil society organizations are drifting to due to the lack of reform of the multilateral system. And the third one is a suggestion of ideas of alternative cooperation that could help also in the financing for development. So looking first at the main topics that have come up, it's mostly climate change. transversal to all the regions that we work in, which is Latin America, Africa, and Asia, but in particular in Latin America, and within that, the topic of migration due to climate change. So within the countries, we're having a lot of displaced persons, and we have, of course, the migration towards the north of the continent due also to, in big part, also due to climate change. The second point are the alternative spaces. So as the network has having strategic conversations, often BRICS and other pluri and minilateral fora come up as a way of, because it's easier to engage with them, because they seem more flexible, more agile than other multilateral fora that are not reforming or evolving, right? And part of the conversation is also, for example, if Chinese think tanks should be part of the network and if we should work with China. And then in contrast, something that never came up was, for example, to work with the European Union and with its institutions. And I think there's two reasons for that. On the one hand, there is maybe not enough or not transparent or good communication from the institutions and the delegations in terms of the instruments they have, such as the Global Gateway or Team Europe. And then on the other hand, for networks as this one that maybe have never engaged with the European Union, they might not even know where to start exactly. So this is a missed opportunity, in particularly because it has to do also with common values. So it's not necessarily a lack of interest, but definitely a lack of outreach that is not coming from the European Union itself. And the third topic is the one of South-South cooperation, which is becoming increasingly interesting and can be a very interesting, not alternative, but complement to North-South cooperation. From our analysis, we have seen some examples where indeed it hasn't gone beyond the signature of the agreement between countries, but then other projects that were really successful, in particular when one of the countries had its own cooperation agency, like for example, Brazil. So we think that there is some room for growth and also for creative thinking in terms of financing. So not just money, because for example, just now someone mentioned corruption, which is indeed a big topic. But many of these projects did the financing also through in-kind donations. So for example, the technicians' hours. So there's an element of knowledge transfer, which is really interesting as well. So in conclusion, these are three of the main topics that keep on coming up at strategic conversations that we have, and that could be interesting insights also in order to find solutions. I agree that ultimately what we need is political will. What we also need is adaptability, flexibility, and more inclusiveness, and particularly in the governance part of the multilateral system. And to remember also that behind the statistics and the data are real people, like this girl that I mentioned at the beginning, and many other children across the Global South that definitely need solutions and real development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. So now, Joseph, I don't know if we have managed to fix your problem, the problem with the sound.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think it was my headsets, the microphone there can be problematic. So thanks very much for having me. It's a bit late in Cape Town. It's 11 o'clock in the evening. So you forgive me if I seem a bit tired. Yeah, so I have a small intervention. So yeah, from an African perspective, obviously this is a pivotal moment for Africa, as the region is striving to have a bigger voice in global matters, especially global governance matters. And now South Africa is assuming the G20 presidency, has assumed the G20 presidency, and has indicated some of the priorities that it wants to drive forward. I think it's fair to say that the positive, there are two positives. One is that the priorities that have been, at least the indication of the priorities, are very well reflected in the elements paper, showing that although we have these multiple forums and we have these multiple discussions happening at the World Bank, IMF, at the World Bank and IMF, in the UN, and the G20. I think we can all agree that there is at least some convergence in terms of the priorities that we are pushing. And I think I wanted to highlight a number of them. So I think the main issue for Africa that is being pushed, I think, is towards resolving the global financial architecture, particularly focusing on the sovereign debt crisis, which is affecting a lot of countries and affecting the implementation of the development initiatives, including the SDGs, climate change. So public debt is obviously high on the agenda, and it's being reflected in the South Africa's priorities for the G20 as well. And it's well reflected also in the elements paper. I think we've talked about climate financing. Although there's been the disappointment of surrounding the 300 billion a year pledge that was achieved at COP29, but I think it's just a reflection of the extent to which there's a climate financing gap in Africa and other developing regions. But I think the most important thing is, as was mentioned earlier, is to recognize that these issues, much as there's some differences in perspectives between the global north and the global south, but the goal is the same, and it's just a matter of finding common ground on what needs to be done. I think one other important area, which I think there is at least a better consensus and a bigger room for agreement, is the issue of domestic resource mobilization. I think African countries have realized that you can source external financing as much as you can, but you cannot deal with all these problems, including the debt sustainability issue, climate financing, without mobilizing adequate resources of your own. And I think developed countries also realize that if we strengthen the tax systems and help capacitate countries to improve, such as tax collection and helping countries combat illicit financial flows, making sure that the big multinational corporations that provide services or operate in these countries are contributing their fair share of taxes. I think this is the outcome would be such that there is less need for external resource mobilization, and we can resolve some of these issues of climate financing and public debt. I think the other priority that African countries are pushing is on investment and trade, recognizing the importance of trade through reforms of the WTO and through promoting of regional trade, like in the case of Africa, the African Continental Free Trade Area. So I think this is an area where cooperation between the global south and the global north also would be adequate to move some of the to move some of the agenda items on the FfD4 agenda. I think there's so many ways that Africa and Europe can keep pushing this together. There's so many examples that we have seen that hopefully will be realized and will make things work. There's the Africa EU Global Gateway Package, for example, which is trying to mobilize 150 billion for investments in Africa. In terms of sustainable financing, we have seen from COP26 with the South African Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which created a partnership. I think an effective partnership between South Africa, France, UK, EU, and the US to try to resolve the climate mitigation problems in South Africa. I think there's room for a lot more partnerships between the EU or the global north in general with other African countries who are. I think some African countries have expressed interest in having similar projects. Some partnerships in infrastructure development, I think, is another area there. That the EU and African partnership is doing well. So I think there is a lot of areas where we can leverage these partnerships, and we can also leverage all the forums that we have out there, the World Bank, IMF, and the G20 and the COP, to make sure that we're pushing the development financing agenda forward. Let me stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And yes, I hadn't realized that it's quite late for you today, so thank you very much for joining us for this session. I think we have like 5 minutes, right, for the debate, but maybe we can turn these 5 minutes into 10? Yeah. Okay, so that means we have time maybe for a couple of questions and comments, and eventually for a very quick round by the speakers. So who has comments, questions, just raise your hand. Nothing. Yeah. And please do introduce yourself briefly.
Volker Hai, Germany, from German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. I don't have a lot of questions actually, but thank you very much for the session. It was very helpful and very interesting. And I just wanted to say that also a lot of these topics that have been mentioned, we very much aligned from German side on what needs to or should be covered in FfD4. And I mean, I cannot repeat all the topics now, but I took a lot of notes. And I think it was very well summarized also, and also framed within this FfD4 context to highlight the importance of these topics. We, from our side, we have submitted quite a comprehensive input to the elements paper with a lot of short snippets of what we could see in the FfD4, and I see a lot of that reflected also in the elements paper. We are currently looking at how we can also focus a little bit more on priorities, as Monica has already also covered a lot of topics that will be a focus for Spain, and we also see a lot of alignment there. We'll try to, I mean, I can just say that, for example, private sector mobilization is certainly a topic that we will have a closer look at. Also, I'm happy to see that also this topic of follow-up mechanism was very well covered today, and I think we also have a keen interest that there will be a strong follow-up mechanism there. Likewise, the topic of climate change is, of course, also a very important point, and we are engaging also I'm engaging with my colleagues in my ministry to see how we can reflect that better in the FfD4 outcome document. And certainly, of course, the topics of domestic resource mobilization, debt, are, of course, on the table, as well as structural questions on the IFA reform. So, yeah. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments or questions or no? Okay. Oh, yeah. Oh, great. Okay. So we have 3.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It was a very interesting session. I'm Céline Kaufmann. I'm the head of programs at IDRI. We're part of ETTG as well. Thank you for all the interventions. The feeling that I get from the element paper and the discussion is that FfD4 will actually push forward in an incremental way some of the reforms that are happening also elsewhere, G20, Bretton Woods, and so on. Is there anywhere where you see opportunity for more fundamental innovation or for pushing a new idea through the process that would go beyond the incremental approach that is completely needed? But is there, an area where you think there can be something that is a bit more disruptive through that process?
Thank you. And then a last question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Of course.
Yeah. I'm Hernan from Oxfam, and I'm part of the civil society. Would be for the FfD4, for the Sevilla, whatever, to realize that governments fulfill the promises. I mean, that there's something that governments can achieve. I mean, we cannot risk have promising things that governments are not gonna fulfill. There's a long tradition of not fulfillment of some of the commitments. So I think that would be something that for civil society will be very important, and not for civil society organizations, but well for citizens. And I think that's important as well. Which is the umbrella? Which is the message? Which is the narrative that government, civil society, and other stakeholders can work together to make this conference a success. Climate change, inequalities, so on, many things on that. And as well, I think it's important we have this feeling that there's like a bit of fragmentation. We have all these processes all together, COPs, G20s, OECDs, UN, but in the end, UN is a space that can bring everyone together in the room. That's not something that happens in other spaces. That is, I think, reinforce the role of the UN. Again, for what the ambassador was mentioning about the trust in the multilateral system will be important. And my question is, what about new emerging topics? Care, for instance. How do you think, as delegates, if you want to say otherwise, a reflection, how can we incorporate these new topics that are very present in the life of a lot of population in the text? Thank you.
Thank you, Hernan. So one last question or comment on the part of Camilo, and then I will give the speakers the possibility to react.
Yeah, now it works. So hello, everyone. My name is Camilo Gamba, and I work at the International Forum on Policy Secretariat. So it's a quick question. Monica, you were talking about lending areas, but at the same time transformative enough to agree for the FfD4. And Rodolfo, you were talking about trying to find ways of collaboration and to avoid this division between North and South. What are your views about exploring areas of work that are aimed to be transformative, but it doesn't need to restart things again? So there are some words in the elements paper that gives the feeling like, okay, we need to create something else from the scratch. But we as the Secretariat think that we don't need to do that. We can build on something that is kind of existing now. So which are your views about the kind of the feeling between the delegates about this idea of starting from something that is already created instead of creating something from the scratch, especially when it comes to statistics for development finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Several of the comments and questions were actually, for Rodolfo and Monica to a large extent. So let me give the floor first to Rodolfo and then to Monica, and then maybe if the rest of the speakers want to add something, I will give them the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for the questions. I think for us as facilitators, it will be, I'm going to be very honest, speaking in these events as a facilitator is difficult because we don't want to tell you what needs to be in the document, right? We're here to guide the process. But I can tell you that when we were discussing what should be in the process or in the discussions, we did obviously see the need to have emerging issues and the need to see new ideas. So I wouldn't say that there's disruptive ideas at this point. I think that if you say something is disruptive here in this context, it means it goes against something that already exists. And this ties to Camilo's question, right? What is the need for something new when you have already things that can complement each other? And in some cases, we understand the assignment, right? You know, the UN space is one that's very much limited by caveats and also mandates. But the way that we see this is whatever we put in the elements paper, we put in the belief that even if some ideas are crazy, say, for example, the debt convention, the debt mechanism, right? That doesn't mean that that idea doesn't have a seed that can begin to grow. Maybe it grows into a debt convention, maybe it grows into something completely different. But that's not for us to decide. The decision lies in the member states and it lies in other stakeholders and say, are we really in a space where we need this initiative, or are we really in this space where we can take and complement that idea with something else that already exists, or to find the innovation? The spaces where we thought innovation was needed was in enablers, right? In tackling those who enable corruption, right? Bringing the angle of transparency, corruption, and financial integrity back to financing for development, because in the end, this is an agenda that also stems from attending to those who are more needy of resources, right? So if you look at how much the African continent struggles with illicit financial flows, not to mention other regions, right? That's something that we need, and it's something that we've got asked for by developed countries, right? It's not ironic, but it's something that, you know, you always want to make sure your investment is secure. And what is the best way to get that across is to make sure everything is transparent. So, of course, areas like STI, the chapter on STI, there's massive ideas there. Massive space also for growth and for progress on Addis, because when we were in 2015, we didn't have the tools that we have now at our disposal. We didn't have the reach for those vulnerable populations that can now access apps in the tips of their fingers. You know, banking systems, you know, in Mexico, and this is Mexico's hat, not facilitators, but, you know, Mexico went through a tax reform in 2021, and we did it through digitalization so that we could withstand the economic shocks of the pandemic, right? But that doesn't mean that that reform is not possible in a world that has no pandemic. This is possible everywhere, right? It's just a matter of whether you understand your citizens and the needs of your citizens. In our case, 70% of people live in poverty, in extreme poverty, and most of them in rural areas where there were no banking systems, they had no access to internet, or it was limited. They had to go to a different village to find Wi-Fi, right? And remittances are huge for Mexico, right? It's not a positive, right? But a lot of remittances also signifies a systemic issue, that you don't have the environment for them to thrive in your country. But it also gives us the opportunity to say, okay, well, if you're out abroad, how to make it easier for you to get in contact with your family and send cash transfers, right? You empower people. So those are the types of ideas that need to be put in place specifically for the whole, right? When you're talking about the vulnerable people, you're talking about the individual. When you're talking about massive systemic issues, that's where I think it is more important to not lose sight of there's other agencies, institutions, countries that are already working on this, and you need to complement the work. And creating something new sometimes is not the best idea, because then you do away with a lot of progress that already has had some success, some impact. We see it in the tax process, right? There's this huge discussion on whether or not it takes into account existing work on the OECD and other agencies, right? It's a question for the membership, but it's also a question of perspective. And as facilitators, if you see the document, we really didn't, where you think there's something new in terms of body or agency, it's mostly because we know that the resources and the complementarity on support, statistics, even staff exists at the UN. So creating something new would just mean, having a track, and then the membership will decide how much that grows. But I don't think that the idea here is to come and say, let's tear everything down. We have to do our vision. On that, you have the review. We'll wait for that to happen as well. But it's a lot about complementarity, and I think that's where the focus lies. It's such a short time from here to Sevilla that it's very hard to create something new from scratch. There's not enough analysis, or maybe there is, but we need to have more discussion. And of course, as facilitators, we remain at your disposal for you to tell us, and we look forward this week for you to telling us if you really need something new, then convince yourselves, and then let us know. And we'll work with you on trying to untangle some of those ideas that were deemed a little bit too disruptive or maybe too ambitious. But in the end, without that ambition, there's no drive and there's no political will, right? We have to aim high, and maybe we won't get to the stars. We'll get a nice, soft cloud to land on in Sevilla. But yeah.
Rodolfo made my answer very short, because you did it very well and very comprehensible. So for me, just thanks for the questions, and just to try to give some last messages now, because I think I agree with what was said by Rodolfo. But I think that, and coming on Germany remark, and as Joseph was telling us, even if there are different perspectives, there are common ground, and there are more than unite than divide us, and the key thing for Sevilla is to try to find this common ground, and it was mentioned domestic resource mobilization by Joseph, but also by Germany, and climate, So. And for me, for Spain, we don't have to be innovative if we are effective. So the key question is to be really transformative, Even if the ideas were there from Addis Ababa, they did not really were actionable, or perhaps they were in the narrative, but there were no clear mandates, clear actions and commitments for member states. So the thing is to have this action plan that could really deliver in a transformative change for the 2030 agenda. But even if this is not necessary to be original and innovative, we think that there are innovative things like the follow-up mechanism. We didn't have that in the past, and this could be really a good deliver to try to be more effective. And coming to Oxfam question, also there are, as you mentioned, for us, care economy is a key question, and other perhaps innovative, even if we don't need to be innovative, is this gender perspective. For us, this is a top priority. We are working on that. We've seen good ideas in the elements paper, but we need to deliver also on this overall gender perspective. And I think for Camilo, it was also a bit answered that we are not coming from scratch, but there are things that just need to be concrete right now in Sevilla. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, but I would like to give both Joseph and Gabriela the possibility of saying something in, please, no more than 30 seconds, so that we are not really late for the next panel, only if you feel like it. No? Yeah, if there is, yeah. Gabriela?
Sure. No, just real quick on the issue of the care economy, which I agree is becoming more and more important. And also there are some important summits next year that will look into it. Of course, Beijing +30 and the World Social Summit. But it is good to have it also in this one as it is a topic that touches everyone and on this planet. So definitely something that we will support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Joseph, anything else you would like to share at this point?
No, for me, I think just to thank you for having me. I don't have much to add.
No, much on the contrary. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of you. I had some few ideas for the conclusion. Sorry, I just skipped Karim's turn, but with his, he was okay with it. So I had several ideas to share, but we ran out of time. So they will be in the short text that we will provide with the conclusions from this session. And thank you all very much, and Yundesa again, and Spanish MFA and AFD, of course, for supporting us on this. Thank you so much.